Sunday fun day at Oracle. Of course, Spurs and Warriors with Kawhi Leonard. The first time they've ever faced in the Western Conference Finals. PJ Carlissimo, your thoughts?
This is a very deep team. It's an extremely well-coached team. This is the team with the second best record, 61 wins. So don't feel badly for San Antonio. This is an excellent basketball team. I think this is going to be a lot better series than most people believe.
Stephen A., your thoughts. What chance are you giving the Spurs?
Well, I'm not giving them much of a chance to beat the Golden State Warriors. To me, the question is how interesting can they make this series? Can they win 2 games? I'd be proud of them if they could win 2 games, to be quite honest with you. Kawhi Leonard will have to be healthy. If Kawhi Leonard is not healthy, they're going to get swept. I don't care what you saw last night. This is not the Houston Rockets. These are the Golden State Warriors. They defend the perimeter, they defend the interior, and they score in bunches. They're explosive. They will run the Spurs out of the building without Kawhi Leonard. It's not going to work. Kawhi Leonard is going to have to be ready so he can neutralize one of the triumvirate, one of the triangle. He's going to have to shut down one of them. So I look at it from that perspective. And then I say to myself, what I really like about the Spurs, I said it before when Tony Parker went down. I love this guy, Jonathan Simmons. I think he's got tremendous potential. Danny Green plays defense. This kid, DeJounte Murray, came off the bench, showed you a few things here and there. Popovich and the Spurs really like this kid. I think he's got a bright future. And finally, there's been a sighting. I called for LaMarcus Aldridge to show up earlier in the series after the way he played the first 2 games. In the last 2 games in Houston, he played big. He is going to have to take advantage of the JaVale McGee's, the Zsa Pachulias, and to a lesser degree, a Draymond Green in the post area. Now, Draymond Green's going to get leverage on him, and he's not going to be able to back Draymond Green down, but he can shoot over him. And he needs to make sure that he's able to do that. If those things happen, this could be a relatively interesting series in terms of it going 6 games. But they're not beating the Golden State Warriors. And if they don't play the way that I described with, not without Kawhi Leonard, with Kawhi Leonard, they're going to get blown out of here.
Yeah, first of all, they have no shot against the Golden State Warriors. And people are hedging a little bit like, well, they can at least make it an interesting series. Go find someone who's going to pick the San Antonio Spurs. I know you can say, well, maybe the Golden State Warriors are vulnerable down low. But even the bigs that San Antonio has, LaMarcus Aldridge and Pau Gasol, those are not bullies down low. They can play in the post, but they're not really low post dominant players. Pau Gasol at his best is in the pinch post, and LaMarcus Aldridge is a jump shooter, really. These are not, so they can exploit somewhat a deficiency there in the Golden State defense, but how much? Look, the Spurs are a very likable team, Stephen A. You brought up Jonathan Simmons. You know, his backstory is amazing. The fact that he's working different jobs, taking care of his 4 daughters and trying out for teams and in the D-League and pays $150 to get a tryout with the Spurs and now is doing this. That's an amazing story. It's a likable team full of likable characters, and they're exceptionally well coached. But that's the thing about the Golden State Warriors. They're also exceptionally well coached, and they're much more talented. So if 2 teams are very well coached and one is much more talented, which team do you think is going to win? I understand the argument, and there's some validity to it, that without Steve Kerr there, it's not Popovich versus Kerr with more talent. It's Popovich versus Mike Brown, where Mike Brown has more talent, and maybe that's a closer kind of match. Now, there's some truth there. The Spurs could win a couple of games in this series, but they also may just get swept, Stephen A. Golden State is a much better team. The Spurs, throughout this season, have been streaky even within games if you've been watching them. Big leads evaporate, and they're just not consistent this year. I know they had a very, very good win-loss record, but they've been inconsistent this year. And what we've seen in the playoffs from them in recent years is like schizophrenia. They played 2 games against Oklahoma City a couple of years ago. They looked like the greatest team ever. And then the next 4 games, they're run out of the gym. Early in the playoffs, they're gone. And then in this series, they looked like they were in real trouble against Houston, and now the series is over. It didn't even go to 7 games. So they're a wildly inconsistent, under-talented team compared to the Golden State Warriors. And even Popovich versus Mike Brown, I don't think it's enough to make up for it, particularly with a compromised Kawhi.
Well, we agree, but I think that the important point to point out here is that so many times in the past, and this is where the greatness of Greg Popovich has to truly be appreciated, and the San Antonio Spurs organization in terms of their development of players. We have to give respect where respect is due, because a lot of times we see guys come on their squad, Max, and they draft some guy from Europe, or they draft some guy in the second round, or whatever the case may be, and somehow they're inserted, they're implemented into the system, and they make valid contributions. What I love about what I'm seeing from the Spurs, Greg Popovich, once upon a time, you just knew he was going to rely on Manu Ginobili. You just knew he was going to rely on Tony Parker. You just knew he was going to rely on Tim Duncan. Not to say that's a bad thing, but he was going to ride him and ride him and ride him. That's what it was going to happen. That's one of the reasons why Steven Jackson used to be frustrated, because even though he loved his teammates and what have you, he also believed in himself and knew how much Popovich loved a guy like Manu, and he was like, what about me? Here's the situation. In San Antonio now, obviously due to injuries, but also because Popovich has shifted a little bit, those young guys, he doesn't mind throwing them in the line of fire. He doesn't mind putting them in those situations where you got this guy Kyle Anderson, you got Jonathan Simmons, you got this kid, I'm sorry, like DeJounte Murray and those other guys. You just see what they do. Deadman as well. You just look at them. He doesn't mind throwing them. And if you've got fresh legs to defend, Max, that could make things interesting against Golden State, because you need to be able to defend.
I bring that up. Not enough coaches play second stringers late in games because they think it's crunch time or in overtime, when fresh legs really make a big difference. But one thing about Popovich and this Spurs team that I do want to point out, I think there's a tendency with him and with Belichick in the NFL, when they make a personnel move, you think, even if it's curious, you go, huh, really? You say, okay, wait, I defer to their judgment. They see something that I don't. And when the Spurs went after LaMarcus Aldridge, not a defender, a mid-range shooter at the time, how does he, by the way, a guy who kind of wasn't happy when he's not the primary scoring option, even yesterday, he picked up the slack for Kawhi. Why can't he do that when Kawhi is playing? Because he's a secondary scoring option and therefore won't play up to his potential? What is that about? So those who thought that's a weird fit with the Spurs, I don't know if that's going to work out. Hard to say a 60-win team who's now advancing to the Western Conference Finals hasn't worked out, but we can see why we thought it was a weird fit with the Spurs. He's not a perfect fit with that team. And the idea that, well, since Popovich thought it would work, it'll work, I don't think it's turned out that way. Well, and maybe he was the best available option, but if he's your second best player, you ain't beating the Warriors.
I will say this, though. The Spurs have won 60-plus games the last 2 years. Last year, they folded in the Western Conference semifinals because LaMarcus Aldridge decided not to show up, to the point where in Game 6, Popovich leaned heavily on Tim Duncan, who was clearly done. He had him playing more than LaMarcus Aldridge. Now, this LaMarcus Aldridge that showed up last night, obviously we want to give him props, but let's make sure to remind everybody that's why he was brought there. He was brought there to do what he did last night. So even though we can appreciate it, we also have a license to expect from him. The reason why I bring up San Antonio, and I keep saying let's not underestimate these guys, because of the youth movement that they've engaged in, combined with Kawhi and a LaMarcus Aldridge, they're athletic enough to be able to compete. This is not a team that we should look at and say, oh, they're going to get blown out, they're going to get obliterated by the Golden State Warriors. If all their horses are ready to play, this should be a competitive series, and if it's not, then we need to look at San Antonio differently. I still got Golden State, but this should be at least a six-game series if San Antonio is as legit as we think they are.
This is not just a Kevin Durant or super team fault or issue in the NBA. The reason that the NBA is the greatest league is also the reason why some of the drama is sometimes sucked out of it, because basketball fundamentally is determined by who has the better team. That's not baseball or football. The best team doesn't always win, so it can be more dramatic and unpredictable. We all know in the NBA that the best team is going to win a best-of-7. So it's nice that you're saying that it'll be competitive. I think also they may be competitive in some games. Find me someone picking the Spurs, actually picking the Spurs. Ain't no one going to pick the Spurs.
Michelle Beadle, and that's probably about it. And I don't even know if Beadle will. Yeah. All right.
Michelle San Antonio Spurs Beadle, yes. Yes,
exactly. So we got another squad that could get it done in 6, gentlemen. The Wizards have their backs against the wall. Will they be able to force a Game 7? History isn't on Washington's side. I will explain after the break. Also ahead, the NFL isn't joshing around with Gordon. The guys will react to the latest news.